I want to ask you something that most history books will never ask you. What does it take to build an empire without a standing army? Not through conquest alone, not through the brute force of iron and blood, though there was plenty of both, but through something far more sophisticated, far more enduring, far more genuinely terrifying to the people who encountered it. What does it take to build an empire through the power of the invisible, through the authority of the sacred, through the specific civilizational intelligence of a people who understood centuries before modern political theory articulated it, that the most durable power is not the power that compels through force, but the power that compels through belief? In the rainforest hinterlands of what is today southeastern Nigeria, between roughly 1690 and 1902, there existed one of the most extraordinary political and economic structures in the history of pre-colonial Africa. It was called the Aro Confederacy. At its height, it controlled the political, economic, and religious life of a territory stretching across all of eastern Nigeria, the lower Middle Belt, southern Igala, and parts of what are today Cameroon and Equatorial Guinea. It operated through a combination of military alliance, commercial genius, and the most powerful oracle institution in West Africa, the IBINI UKPABI, known by outsiders as the Long Juju of Arochukwu. And it did all of this from a capital city that most of the world has never heard of, a city called Arochukwu. My name is Chinagorom, and today we are going to tell the complete story of the Aro Confederacy, from the bloody civil war that created it, through the brilliant commercial and religious system that sustained it, to the British imperial expedition that destroyed it. This is not a footnote to Nigerian history. This is Nigerian history. And it begins, like all the most consequential stories, with a war. Before there was an Aro Confederacy, there was a world. And I need you to understand that world before I tell you what happened to it, because you cannot understand the extraordinary political achievement of the Aro Confederacy without first understanding the specific landscape of peoples, trade routes, political tensions, and accumulated grievances from which it emerged. The region we're entering is the Cross River Basin of what is today southeastern Nigeria, a landscape of dense rainforest, winding rivers, and extraordinary ethnic diversity. By the late 17th century, this region was home to multiple distinct peoples, the Igbo, speaking their own language and organized into the complex network of autonomous communities and city-states that characterized Igbo political culture. The Ibibio, one of the oldest and most deeply rooted peoples of the region, with their own governance structures, their own religious traditions, their own accumulated history stretching back centuries before the events we are about to discuss. And the Abam, a formidable warrior people from the Okoyon clan of the Calabar region, whose fighting reputation had made them one of the most sought-after military forces in the entire Cross River area. Three peoples, three distinct cultures and languages, three sets of economic interests, political ambitions, and historical relationships. And at the center of this complex human landscape, a kingdom, the IBOM Kingdom. The IBOM Kingdom had been the dominant political structure of this region for generations. Its capital was Okon-Ita, a fortified city that served simultaneously as the political center of the kingdom, the administrative headquarters of its paramount ruler, the Obong, and the religious center of the Ibibio world, home to the Inebubo, the oracle institution whose spiritual authority provided the ideological foundation for the IBOM political power. The Obom, the central council, governed the kingdom with the authority of tradition and the legitimacy of religious sanction. The Obong, the revealed king, sat at the apex of a political system that had organized life in this region for longer than most living people could remember. And then, the tensions that had been building for decades finally broke into open war. The roots of the conflict that would destroy the IBOM kingdom and create the Aro Confederacy in its place were economic before they were political, and political before they were military. European traders had been establishing forts and trading posts along the West African coast since the 15th century, but the early European traders did not venture into the hinterlands. The tropical diseases and the genuine military power of interior African peoples made direct European penetration of the interior prohibitively costly. Instead, European commercial interests depended on coastal kingdoms as intermediaries, buying and selling through the established trading networks of the coast. This created an enormous commercial opportunity for interior peoples who could find ways to bypass the coastal middlemen and establish their own direct connections to European trade. The Igbo merchant class that had been moving into the Cross River region, specifically the Igbo subgroups who would become one of the founding elements of the Aro Confederacy, understood this opportunity with extraordinary clarity. They were, by the late 17th century, already the dominant commercial presence in the Cross River region. Their trading networks extended across vast distances, their commercial intelligence was sophisticated, and their organizational capacity for moving goods through complex terrain was unmatched. Having established dominance in the commercial activities of the Cross River region, the Igbo merchant class increasingly controlled the economic and productive forces of the society, making them, in effect, an ownership and merchant class whose wealth and influence increasingly challenged the political authority of the IBOM kingdom's Ibibio leadership. Class tensions and ethnic tensions became, as they always do, mutually reinforcing. The conflict that was coming was simultaneously about trade routes, about political authority, about ethnic identity, and about the fundamental question of who controlled the economic future of the Cross River Basin. By 1688, the kingdom was in open civil war.
The civil war that destroyed the IBOM kingdom and created the Aro Confederacy in its place was, at its heart, a conflict between two sons of the same father. Obong Okon Ita, the previous ruler of the IBOM kingdom, had understood the reality of the changing demographic and economic landscape in his territory. His kingdom's future depended on managing the relationship between the indigenous Ibibio population and the increasingly powerful Igbo merchant class that had established itself within his borders. He had attempted to manage this through the most ancient and reliable diplomatic mechanism available to him. He married an Igbo bride. Their son was Prince Aka Okon, a young man of mixed Igbo-Ibibio heritage who, when the succession crisis came, would represent the interests and the backing of the Igbo merchant class against his half-brother, the incumbent Obong Aban Okon, who represented the traditional Ibibio ruling class. The specific causes of the succession dispute are not entirely clear from the available historical record. What is clear is that by 1688, 2 years before the decisive battle that would end the IBOM kingdom, the conflict had escalated from succession dispute to full-scale civil war, with the Igbo merchant class led by Agwinoi backing Prince Aka Okon and the Ibibio establishment backing Obong Aban Okon.
I want to tell you about Agwini Onubi, because Agwini Onubi is one of the most consequential and least celebrated figures in the pre-colonial history of Nigeria. The leader of the Igbo faction in the Civil War, a military commander of genuine tactical sophistication, and the man whose strategic intelligence would transform a succession dispute into the founding moment of one of West Africa's most extraordinary political structures. Agwini Onubi's faction had the commercial resources that the prince needed, the accumulated wealth of the Igbo merchant class, the trade networks that could supply an army, the commercial relationships that could bring mercenaries and fighters from across the region.
What they lacked in the early years of the conflict was the manpower to replace the losses their forces were sustaining against the IBOM kingdom's larger and better established army. By approximately 1688, both sides were exhausted. The war had been fought to a stalemate that neither side could break. The prince's forces too depleted to press their advantage, the Obong's forces too committed to their defensive positions to launch a decisive offensive. The conflict ground on, consuming men and resources from both sides, with no clear resolution in sight. And then Agwini Onubi made a move that changed everything. He invited Nachi. Nachi was a man of extraordinary reputation in the Cross River region of the late 17th century. His title was Iba Priest Doctor, a religious and healing practitioner whose specific combination of spiritual authority and medical knowledge had made him one of the most sought-after and most feared figures in the region. He was described as an itinerant holy man moving between communities, known to possess both magical powers and healing abilities that had produced results that no purely naturalistic explanation could satisfactorily account for. In the specific context of the late 17th century Cross River Basin, where spiritual authority was not merely a supplement to political power but its foundation, where the legitimacy of rulers depended on their relationship with the divine, and where the morale of armies was as much a product of religious conviction as of material preparation, a figure of Nachi's reputation was a strategic asset of the first order. His arrival in the camp of Prince Aka Okon and Agwini Onubi must have sent a specific kind of terror through the IBIBO forces opposing them, not the terror of a new weapon or a new tactical formation, the deeper, more disorienting terror of a people watching what they understood as divine sanction shift from their side to the other. Nachi prophesied total victory for the prince. But the IBIBO forces did not break. They received reinforcements from the surrounding kingdoms. They rallied around their own oracle, the Nbube. The conflict continued. And then Nachi invited the IBOM.
The Aba mercenaries from the Okoyong clan of the Calabar region were by the late 17th century already established trade partners of the Igbo merchant class. Their military reputation was fearsome. They were among the most effective fighting forces in the entire Cross River region. And crucially, unlike virtually every other military force in the interior hinterlands at this time, they had firearms. They were early traders with the Portuguese on the coast. They had acquired European muskets, and they were willing to bring those muskets to the service of Agwinobi's faction in exchange for the commercial arrangements that would follow a prince's victory. The three-faction alliance was now complete. The Igbo merchant class under Agwinobi, the mixed Igbo-Ibibio prince Aka Okon and his forces, and the Aba mercenaries under the brothers Osim and Akoma Nubi, armed with European firearms. The stage was set for the decisive battle. The battle that ended the IBOM kingdom and created the conditions for the Aro Confederacy's founding was fought in the dry season of 1690. I want to walk you through it in detail, because understanding this battle is essential to understanding the Aro Confederacy that emerged from it. The strategic intelligence displayed at OTOTO, the specific combination of tactical deception, weaponry advantage, and disciplined execution that produced its outcome, was not merely the product of military competence. It was an expression of the broader intellectual sophistication that would characterize the Aro Confederacy for the next 2 centuries. Agwinobi knew his situation precisely. His combined force numbered approximately 7,000 warriors, including 1,500 Aba mercenaries, of whom the majority were armed with European muskets. Against them, the Obong's royal army was thought to number approximately 12,000 men, nearly twice their strength, supplemented by additional forces from allied Ibibio kingdoms and surrounding towns. Numbers alone would not decide this battle, which meant that the battle had to be decided by something other than numbers. Agwinobi's strategic plan was built around a single insight of devastating simplicity. The Obong's commanders would fight the battle they expected to fight, not the battle Agwinobi intended to give them. What they expected was a conventional engagement, 2 armies of archers and spearmen meeting on an open field.
the larger force using its numerical advantage to overwhelm the smaller. This was the standard battle template of West African interior warfare in the late 17th century, and the Obong's army was well prepared to fight exactly this kind of battle. What Aguinobi planned to give them was something entirely different. He located a flat plain surrounded by thick tree lines and dense bush, a landscape that looked like an ideal conventional battlefield, but was in fact a killing ground for a flanking ambush. He moved his combined force to a position south of OTOTO, threatening the IBOM capital Okon-Ita directly, forcing the Obong's army to come to him, to fight on the ground he had chosen rather than the ground they would have chosen.
The Abam and Eda forces, the mercenaries with firearms, were hidden in the dense tree lines on both flanks of the chosen battlefield, completely undetected by the Obong scouts. The plan depended on two things: the discipline of the main line to hold under pressure from a numerically superior force, and the concealment of the flanking elements until the precise moment when the Obong's entire army had committed to the central engagement. When the right moment came, when the Obong, convinced that victory was within reach, committed his entire force to the battle, Aguinobi would spring the trap. The morning of the battle began with the standard opening of West African interior warfare. Archers from both sides advancing to exchange volleys, probing for weakness in the enemy formation, testing resilience before the main engagement. The armies of the late 17th century Cross River region were well matched in their conventional equipment. Both sides fielded archers armed with semi-long bows of approximately 4 feet in length, each archer carrying an arrow pouch and a sword for close-quarter combat when the arrows ran out. Both sides fielded spearmen carrying long spears with leather-covered wooden shields and swords for close work. Neither side had cavalry. Horses were unsuitable for the forest region and did not survive long in the tsetse-fly zones of the Cross River Basin. The initial exchange of arrows across the battlefield was a probe, Aguinobi's archers advancing to create the impression of a conventional engagement, drawing the Obong's forces forward, building the royal army's confidence in what they were about to fight. Then the Obong's forces advanced to close quarters.
What followed was one of the most brutal hours in the early history of the Cross River region. The royal forces crashed into Aguinobi's main line with the specific ferocity of a larger army confident in its numerical advantage. Hundreds of men fell in the initial impact. The rebel front line almost broke, the disciplined warriors of the Abariba and Abam contingents in the center holding their formation by sheer will as the royal forces pressed the advantage. The battle devolved, as battles of this kind always did, into chaotic close-quarter combat, where individual fighting skill was everything and tactical formations became fluid and personal. The field became what Aguinobi's own warriors later described as a meat grinder, littered with blood and dead bodies, no side having a clear upper hand, both forces consuming themselves in the grinding horror of prolonged hand-to-hand combat. And then, on the rebel left flank, everything nearly collapsed. Prince Aka Okon, commanding the left flank with his Ibibio contingent, was isolated in the fighting and killed. His head was cut off and sent to the Obong behind the royal lines, a war trophy of devastating symbolic significance. The prince's contingent began to break. Warriors started fleeing the field. The rebel left flank was collapsing.
This is the moment that separates commanders from leaders. Aguinobi, watching from the center as the left flank dissolved, reacted with the specific speed of a man who had already considered this possibility and knew exactly what to do. He pulled Abariba kinsmen from the center, weakening his own position, and used them to stabilize the collapsing left before the royal forces could exploit the gap. It worked. The left held, but barely. And now, the Obong, seeing the rebel line buckling and the left in chaos, made the decision that Aguinobi had been engineering the entire battle to produce. He committed his entire army. Every reserve, every remaining warrior, the full weight of the royal force thrown forward for the decisive kill. Every one of the Obong's 12,000 men was now engaged, advancing, committed to the destruction of the rebel center.
and on both flanks, hidden in the tree lines, 2,500 Abam and Eda warriors heard the signal. The sound that the Obong's army heard from both flanks simultaneously, in the middle of what they believed was their moment of decisive victory, was something most of them had never heard before in their lives. Musket fire. 1,000 shots per volley from each flank, European firearms discharging into the tight formation of a confident royal army that had no experience of gunpowder weapons, no tactical doctrine for responding to them, no psychological preparation for the specific combination of sound and smoke and the sudden appearance of men falling that firearms produced in first encounter. The Obong's formation broke, not gradually, not in the measured way that armies break under conventional pressure, catastrophically, instantly. The way formations break when something happens that the warriors inside them cannot process within any framework of previous encounter. Warriors fell in hundreds across the field. The tight formation, which had been the Royal Army's greatest strength in the initial engagement, became its greatest vulnerability as the musket balls tore through ranks of closely packed men. And then, through the white smoke billowing from both flanks, the war cry went up. 2,500 warriors charging from both sides simultaneously. The flanking attack had sprung.
What followed was the bloodiest phase of the battle. The Obong's army, which had been on the verge of victory moments before, found itself fighting for survival, encircled, flanked, facing a weapon technology it had never encountered and a tactical situation it had no answer for. The Obong himself fought with extraordinary personal courage. Rallying his household guards, he attempted to break through the Abam contingent led by Osim Nubi and open an escape route to the city. The fighting here was fierce and brutal, exactly the kind of desperate point-blank combat that close encirclement produces. Osim Nubi, understanding that killing the Obong would collapse all remaining resistance, selected his best warriors and led a direct assault on the royal position. They cut through the surrounding fighting, pressing towards the Obong through the chaos of the encirclement. Osim was hit by an arrow in the neck. He fell, drowning in his own blood, and died before the battle ended. His brother Akoma, galvanized by grief and fury, took up the assault. The Obong's household guards were cut down. The Obong himself died fighting, and his body was decapitated according to the custom of the time. By sundown, approximately 8,000 Ibibio warriors and their allies lay dead or dying on the field. 2,000 were taken prisoner and later enslaved. The few survivors fled south. The rebel forces sustained approximately 3,000 dead, mostly in the brutal opening phase of the battle, before the flanking attack had turned the tide. The IBOM kingdom was finished. In honor of Osim Nubi's sacrifice, he had died securing the victory that his faction needed. His brother Akoma was crowned the first Aro. The Aro Confederacy was born.
What the founding generation of the Aro Confederacy built in the 3 decades after the Battle of OTOTO was one of the most sophisticated political and economic structures in the history of pre-colonial West Africa. And the foundation they built it on was not military, it was spiritual.
The oracle of the IBINI UKPABI, known to outsiders as the long Juju of arochukwu, was the ideological engine of the Aro Confederacy's power. Understanding it is essential to understanding everything else about how this extraordinary institution functioned. The IBINI UKPABI was, in its physical form, a sacred site in the forests near Arochukwu, a grove, a riverine sanctuary, a place of pilgrimage and judgment, whose spiritual authority had been established and carefully cultivated over generations. People came to the IBINI UKPABI from across the entire region, from hundreds of miles away, traveling through difficult terrain to seek justice, to resolve disputes that could not be resolved by any secular authority, to request divine intervention in personal and communal crises, to obtain the blessing or the judgment of a power that transcended any earthly political structure. The oracle's authority was, in the political conditions of the Cross River region, genuinely unparalleled.
In a world where the legitimacy of all political authority ultimately derived from its relationship with the divine, where a ruler's power depended on the spiritual sanction that oral traditions, ritual specialists, and oracle institutions provided, control of the region's most authoritative oracle was the most powerful political asset imaginable. The Aro controlled the IBINI UKPABI, not because they had been given this control, because they had won it at OTOTO, in the civil war that gave them command of the oracle sanctuary along with everything else they had conquered.
The Aro used their control of the IBINI UKPABI with extraordinary strategic sophistication. The oracle was both genuinely sacred and deliberately political. The Aro priests who managed it were not fraudsters performing an empty show. The IBINI UKPABI's spiritual authority was real to everyone who interacted with it, including the Aro themselves. But the Aro also understood that sacred authority could be deployed in the service of specific political and commercial objectives, and they were remarkably skilled at doing exactly that. The oracle's judgments consistently reinforced Aro commercial and political interests. Disputes that were resolved in favor of Aro trade network access, decisions that opened new communities to Aro commercial penetration, verdicts that strengthened the hand of Aro-allied factions in local political conflicts, and the ultimate sanction of the oracle, the disappearance into the oracle grove of those who had been judged by the IBINI UKPABI and not emerged, was the most powerful enforcement mechanism available in the entire region. Those who were taken by the oracle had in many cases been enslaved and sold into the Atlantic slave trade. The oracle's authority served as the ideological cover for a commercial operation of extraordinary scale, transforming the Aro Confederacy into the dominant supplier of enslaved people from the interior of the Cross River region to the coastal trading posts of the Atlantic network.
The commercial genius of the Aro Confederacy was the product of a specific insight that its founders had arrived at through the bitter experience of watching coastal kingdoms extract enormous profits from their position as middlemen between European traders and the African interior. The Aro decided to eliminate the middlemen. Not all at once, not through conquest, which would have been militarily difficult and politically costly, but through the patient, systematic construction of a commercial network that reached directly from the interior of the Cross River region to the coast, controlled at every node by Aro traders or Aro-allied communities. This network was built over the 3 decades from 1690 to 1720, and by the time of its maturity, it was one of the most sophisticated trading systems in West Africa. The Aro trading diaspora was its operational mechanism. Aro traders, often operating as families or extended kinship groups, established permanent settlements in communities across the entire region covered by the Confederacy's commercial reach. These settlements served simultaneously as commercial outposts, intelligence gathering operations, political liaison offices, and local representations of the oracle's authority. An Aro trader, arriving in a new community, brought with him not just commercial goods, but the implicit sponsorship of the IBINI UKPABI. His presence in a community was simultaneously a commercial proposition and a political statement. Communities that welcomed Aro traders, that opened their markets to Aro commercial networks, that accepted the oracle's authority in their dispute resolution processes, these communities gained access to the enormous commercial network that the Aro controlled, including access to European manufactured goods that could previously only be obtained through multiple layers of coastal middlemen. Communities that resisted Aro commercial penetration, that refused to accept Aro traders, that challenged the oracle's authority, that attempted to maintain independent commercial networks that competed with Aro interests, faced the specific consequences that came from being cut off from the most powerful commercial network in the region and from the oracle's displeasure. The Aro did not need to send armies to most of the communities they sought to incorporate into their network. The combination of commercial incentive and spiritual sanction was sufficient. But where it was not sufficient, the Aro had the IBOM.
The military dimension of the Aro Confederacy's power was primarily outsourced.
This was another expression of the Aro's fundamental strategic sophistication. They were not warriors by culture or by preference. They were merchants and priests. And rather than building their own standing army, with all the costs and organizational complexity that entailed, they maintained a series of military alliances with specialized warrior peoples who provided military enforcement services in exchange for commercial access and Aro protection. The IBOM, whose mercenaries had been decisive at the Battle of OTOTO, remained the most important of these military partners throughout the Confederacy's history. The Ofaya and Abiriba, skilled archers whose reputation across the region was formidable, were also part of the military alliance network. These warrior peoples would be deployed when Aro commercial interests required military enforcement, when a community that had defied Aro authority needed to be reminded of the consequences of defiance, when a trade route needed to be cleared of obstacles, when a display of force was necessary to reinforce the implicit threat behind the oracle's judgments. The system was elegant and cost-effective. The Aro maintained the appearance of a peaceful commercial and religious institution while retaining the capacity for devastating military action through their outsourced enforcement arm.
The commercial goods that flowed through the Aro network were diverse and valuable. Agricultural products, palm oil, yams, livestock, moved between the different ecological zones of the region through Aro-controlled trade routes. Manufactured goods, iron tools, cloth, salt, moved from the coast and the north into the interior through Aro commercial channels. Luxury goods, copper, beads, European manufactured items, circulated through the network as markers of status and as commercial currency. And enslaved people. The Aro Confederacy was, in the brutal economic reality of the 18th century cross-river region, one of the primary organizational mechanisms through which the Atlantic slave trade penetrated the interior of southeastern Nigeria. The oracle's authority, the disappearance of the judged into the grove, was one route. The military campaigns of the Abal allies were another. The commercial networks that the Aro maintained created the infrastructure through which enslaved people were moved from their communities of origin to the coastal trading posts where European slave ships waited. This is the part of the Aro Confederacy's history that is most difficult to engage with honestly, and that I believe demands honest engagement, rather than the comfortable omissions that allow a narrative of African civilization to avoid its own internal contradictions. The Aro Confederacy was brilliant. It was sophisticated. It was a genuine civilizational achievement of the first order, a political and commercial structure of extraordinary complexity and effectiveness, built entirely through African ingenuity and organizational capacity. It was also deeply embedded in the institution of slavery in ways that cannot be separated from its commercial success. The oracle's authority and the Atlantic slave trade were, in the Aro system, mutually reinforcing. One provided the ideological cover, the other provided the commercial engine. Together, they made the Aro Confederacy rich, powerful, and for 2 centuries essentially untouchable. This complexity is the Aro Confederacy's history. All of it.
I want to spend more time with the oracle, because the IBINI UKPABI, the long Juju of Arochukwu, deserves to be understood in its full complexity, rather than dismissed as a cynical fraud or romanticized as a pure expression of African spirituality. It was both more and less than either of those descriptions.
The Oracle Grove was located in a forest near Arochukwu, a sacred landscape of extraordinary atmosphere. The specific combination of dense tropical forest, hidden water, and accumulated spiritual significance that made it genuinely, physically different from the surrounding landscape in ways that even the most skeptical visitor would feel. The pilgrimage to the oracle was itself a significant undertaking. People came from hundreds of miles away, traveling through difficult terrain, spending days or weeks on the journey.
The physical difficulty of the pilgrimage was part of its spiritual significance. The effort required demonstrated the seriousness of the supplicant's need and the sincerity of their engagement with the oracle's authority. The cases brought to the oracle were genuinely important. Land disputes between communities, accusations of witchcraft, commercial disagreements of sufficient magnitude to require a judgment beyond what any local authority could provide, personal crises of health and fertility and family breakdown that had resisted every other form of intervention. The Aro priests who managed the oracle were skilled practitioners of what might be described as a sophisticated combination of religious authority, psychological insight, political intelligence, and theatrical management. They maintained an extensive network of informants across the region. The same trading diaspora that served their commercial interests also served as their intelligence operation, providing the oracle's priests with detailed information about the cases coming before them, the people bringing them, and the political context in which the judgments would be received. An oracle that knew the details of your case before you arrived, that could speak to specific facts of your situation that no stranger could legitimately know, was an oracle whose authority was very difficult to challenge.
The ultimate sanction, the disappearance of the judged, operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On the spiritual level, the person had been taken by the oracle, consumed by its power, removed from the world of the living in punishment for their transgressions. This was the explanation given and broadly accepted. On the practical level, in many cases, the person had been enslaved, handed over to the Aro commercial network, moved through the trade routes to the coast, loaded onto a slave ship, disappeared as promised. The genius and the horror of the system were inseparable. The same mechanism that made the oracle's authority unchallengeable, the finality of disappearance, the impossibility of return, the divine sanction that no earthly power could contest, was the mechanism that generated one of the primary revenue streams of the Aro commercial empire. And because the authority of the oracle was genuine to the people who encountered it, because the IBINI UKPABI was not merely a performance, but a real institution with real spiritual power in the worldview of the Cross River region, the system was self-sustaining in a way that purely coercive arrangements never are. People came to the oracle because they believed in it, and the Aro, who had built their entire political and commercial empire on the foundation of that belief, had every incentive to ensure that the belief was maintained.
At its zenith, roughly the middle decades of the 18th century, the Aro Confederacy was the dominant political and economic force across all of eastern Nigeria, the lower Middle Belt, southern Igala, and portions of what are today Cameroon and Equatorial Guinea. This was an enormous territory. Managing it required not just military capacity and commercial networks, but a genuine administrative intelligence, a capacity for political organization and governance that the Aro Confederacy developed to an extraordinary degree. The central institutions of the Confederacy were organized around arochukwu itself. The Ikeji, the central council known as the Okpankwu, provided political governance. The oracle priests managed the IBINI UKPABI. The Aro, the paramount ruler, served as the symbolic and ceremonial center of the Confederation's political authority, with the specific characteristic of Aro kingship being its explicitly revealed nature. The Aro was not merely a political appointment, but a sacral position, his authority deriving from and legitimized by his relationship with the oracle. Below the central institutions, the Confederacy operated through a network of relationships with subordinate and allied communities that was more flexible and more sophisticated than the rigid hierarchies of conventional territorial empires.
The Aro system was a confederacy in the genuine sense, a political arrangement in which the component units retained significant internal autonomy while being bound to the center
through commercial relationships, spiritual obligations, and the implicit understanding that the Aro's military allies could be deployed against communities that challenged the terms of the arrangement. This flexibility was one of the Confederacy's greatest strengths. Rather than the administrative overhead of direct territorial governance, the garrisons, the bureaucracy, the logistics of maintaining political control over vast distances, the Aro achieved the practical benefits of imperial reach through a system of relationships that was cheaper to maintain, more adaptable to local conditions, and significantly more difficult to attack than a conventional territorial empire. You cannot besiege a commercial network. You cannot bombard an oracle. You cannot conquer a system of relationships that exists simultaneously at hundreds of nodes across an enormous territory. This would prove to be the Aro Confederacy's greatest structural advantage, and in the end, the reason that the British found it so difficult to destroy, even after they had destroyed Arochukwu itself.
The 19th century brought challenges to the Aro Confederacy that its founding generation could not have anticipated. The most fundamental was the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. Britain, which had been one of the primary drivers of the transatlantic slave trade for nearly 2 centuries and was now its most aggressive opponent, formally abolished the trade in 1807 and spent the subsequent decades using the Royal Navy to enforce the abolition against other European nations still participating. For the Aro Confederacy, whose commercial empire had been built around its control of interior-to-coast supply chains for enslaved people, the abolition was an economic catastrophe of the first order. The commodity that had generated the largest share of the Confederacy's commercial revenues was no longer legally saleable to the European buyers who had been its primary market. The Aro adapted, as they had always adapted, with the commercial flexibility that was one of their defining institutional characteristics. Palm oil, which the industrializing economies of Europe required in enormous quantities for soap, lubricants, and food processing, became the primary commodity of the new commercial order. The Aro trading network, which had been optimized for moving enslaved people from the interior to the coast, was retooled to move palm oil along the same routes. But the adaptation was not seamless. The domestic slave trade within the region, the use of enslaved labor in palm oil production, in agricultural work, in domestic service, actually increased as the external market disappeared, creating new internal contradictions within the Aro commercial system.
And on the political horizon, a new and more dangerous threat was forming. The British Empire, having established itself in Lagos in 1861 and extending its reach steadily through the Niger Delta and the lower Cross River region in the subsequent decades, was beginning to see the Aro Confederacy as an obstacle to its own commercial and political ambitions in southeastern Nigeria. The specific British complaints about the Aro were multiple and mutually reinforcing: the continued domestic slave trade that operated through the Aro network, the oracle's practice of disappearing people that the British found both morally offensive and commercially problematic, the Aro's consistent resistance to British commercial penetration of the interior, and the specific military threat posed by the IBOM and allied warrior peoples whose services the Aro retained. British missionaries, colonial administrators, and commercial interests each had their own reasons for wanting the Aro system dismantled. The missionaries wanted access to the interior communities that the Aro network controlled to preach and convert without the mediation of a religious system they found abhorrent. The colonial administrators wanted direct political control of the southeastern Nigerian interior that the Aro's network of indirect influence effectively prevented. The commercial interests wanted direct access to the palm oil producers of the interior without paying the tolls and accepting the terms that the Aro trade network required. Together, they created the political pressure for military action.
In December 1901, the British colonial administration in southern Nigeria launched what it called the Aro Expedition, a military campaign specifically designed to destroy the Aro Confederacy, abolish the IBINI oracle, and open the southeastern Nigerian interior to direct British colonial administration. The expedition was formidable. 4 columns of British-led forces moved simultaneously on Arochukwu from different directions. The coordinated assault of a modern colonial military operation against a target it had studied and prepared for. The British forces were equipped with modern rifles, artillery, and the specific military advantages of the most powerful empire of the late 19th century. The Aro and their allied warrior peoples, the IBOM, the Ofatia, the Abiriba, fought with the ferocity and the local tactical knowledge that had made them formidable opponents for 2 centuries. But the military outcome was not in doubt. The same technological gap that had defined the scramble for Africa, modern firearms against traditional weapons, operated with the same terrible efficiency in the forests of the Cross River Basin as it had on the open plains of the Sahel or the mountain passes of the Ethiopian highlands.
Arochukwu fell in March 1902. The Oracle Grove was entered by British forces, the first time outsiders had penetrated the sacred space, whose inviolability had been the foundation of the Oracle's authority for 2 centuries. The physical structures of the IBINI UKPABI were examined, documented, and demolished. The British expedition reported finding the bones of those who had been taken by the Oracle, the evidence of what the Oracle's disappearances had actually meant in physical reality. The discovery was used to justify the expedition retroactively as a humanitarian intervention, the destruction of a system that had been killing and enslaving people under the cover of divine authority. The Oracle of the Long Juju, the ideological foundation of the Aro Confederacy's political and commercial empire, was officially abolished. The Aro Confederacy, which had governed the political and economic life of eastern Nigeria for 2 centuries, ceased to exist as an independent political entity. It became, like the Kingdom of Congo and the Kingdom of Kush and the Ashanti Empire and every other African political structure that the British Empire encountered in this period, a colonial possession.
I want to be precise about what was destroyed at Arochukwu in March 1902. Not just a political structure, not just an economic network, not just a religious institution, though it was all of those things. What was destroyed was a specific, irreplaceable, 2-century experiment in African political organization, a demonstration that the Cross River peoples of southeastern Nigeria were capable entirely on their own terms and through their own intellectual resources of building a political and commercial structure of genuinely extraordinary complexity and effectiveness. The Aro Confederacy was not a simple chieftaincy. It was not a tribal structure organized around kinship and territorial proximity. It was a sophisticated political entity with genuine administrative institutions, a flexible federal structure that managed the autonomous interests of multiple ethnic groups within a larger political framework, a commercial network of remarkable reach and effectiveness, and an ideological foundation, the Oracle institution, that provided the spiritual legitimacy without which no political structure in this cultural context could sustain itself. It took the British Empire an organized military expedition of 4 columns, modern artillery, and the full weight of the most powerful colonial power of the late 19th century to destroy it. That is the measure of what it was.
The Aro Confederacy collapsed in March 1902, but it did not disappear. The Aro people are still in Arochukwu. The city still exists in modern Abia state of southeastern Nigeria, a living community with its own history, its own identity, its own memory of what was built there. The 3 ethnic groups that the Confederacy's founding generation united, Igbo, Ibibio, and Abam, are still the demographic reality of the Cross River region. The commercial traditions that made the Aro one of the most sophisticated trading peoples in West Africa are still visible in the specific entrepreneurial culture of the region.
The oracle is gone. The confederacy is gone. The political structure that organized the life of Eastern Nigeria for 2 centuries is gone. But the people remain. And their story, the complete story, with all its complexity and all its contradictions, deserves to be told. I want to tell you why this history matters beyond the intrinsic fascination of an extraordinary story. It matters because the Aro Confederacy is one of the clearest available demonstrations of what pre-colonial African political organization was actually capable of, not the simplified, primitivized version that colonial historiography required, the tribes and chiefs and simple kinship structures that needed European civilization to introduce them to organized governance. The real thing, a federal political structure managing the autonomous interests of multiple ethnic groups across an enormous territory. A commercial network of continental scope built entirely through indigenous organizational capacity. A legal and dispute resolution system, the Oracle, that commanded genuine cross-ethnic authority across hundreds of communities over 2 centuries. This is what was there. This is what the British destroyed. And it matters because the destruction of the Aro Confederacy, like the destruction of every other sophisticated pre-colonial African political structure, did not simply create a political vacuum that British colonial administration filled. It destroyed the specific institutional knowledge, the accumulated governance experience, the political traditions and administrative capacities that the Aro had developed over 2 centuries. Colonial administration did not build on what was there. It demolished what was there and replaced it with something designed to serve colonial interests rather than the interests of the people being governed. The political challenges of southeastern Nigeria today, the governance difficulties, the ethnic tensions, the economic inequalities, cannot be understood without understanding what was destroyed at Arochukwu in March 1902 and in the colonial period that followed.
The Aro Confederacy was founded in 1690 by 3 peoples who had been fighting each other and decided to build something instead. An Igbo merchant class with commercial genius and strategic intelligence. An oracle priest with spiritual authority that commanded the entire region. And 2 brothers from the IBOM warrior people, one of whom died in the battle that made everything possible, and whose sacrifice was honored by naming the new kingdom after his legacy. They built something extraordinary, something that lasted 200 years, something that the most powerful empire of the 19th century needed a 4-column military expedition to destroy. That story deserves to be known. It deserves to be told in full. It deserves to be taught alongside the Ashanti Empire and the Kingdom of Congo and the 25th dynasty of Egypt and every other expression of African political genius that the colonial era spent so much effort trying to make invisible. Because visibility is the first act of justice, and accuracy, the complete, complicated, morally honest account of what actually happened, is the only foundation on which genuine understanding can be built.
If this story changed how you understand the history of southeastern Nigeria, share it, because the stories that history forgot are the ones most worth remembering. Subscribe. New content drops weekly. The complete story, always.